On the other side, however, of the middle terms are expressions that aspire to the philosophical elaboration of those middle terms, elaborations intended to make their real content, and therefore the proper basis of their authority, perspicuous to reason. In the Kantian tradition, the elaborations refer to rational agency, or just to rational beings, and the kinds of respect owed to rational agency or to rational beings. And that tradition, as I said earlier, looks with suspicion, if not actual hostility, on the power of the middle terms, of the power that they've achieved on account of their engagement with ways of speaking that express and celebrate human fellowship. From that perspective, that power looks like rhetorical power in the pejorative sense of that phrase. And deep though that thought goes in the philosophical tradition, including the legal philosophical tradition, it misrepresents things, I think, as I've tried to suggest before. Our use of the expressions in our natural language, from which I believe the middle terms gain their power for us, is subject to a discipline achieved by the application of a range of concepts that tell us when we can trust the way that they move us and when we can't trust it. And they're the concepts that define thought in what earlier I called the realm of meaning. And to develop these thoughts just a little further and to make them a little more concrete, I come to my second example, The Reader, a famous novel written by Bernhard Schlink and adapted to a film starring Kate Winslet and Ralph Fiennes. Schlink is also a professor of legal philosophy in Germany, and his recent book, Guilt About the Past, which was developed from lectures he gave in Oxford in 2008, is a work of legal philosophy, though one in which the novelist is recognisably present, as some of you may have heard Schlink deliver last year a lecture whose title was Guilt About the Past at the Melbourne Writers' Festival. But although every chapter of Guilt About the Past could have been headed with a quote from the reader, it shouldn't be taken merely as commentary on the reader. In Guilt About the Past, Schlink writes analytically about what had preoccupied him as a novelist when he wrote The Reader. Collective responsibility as it applies to what he calls the second generation, that is, Germans who in the 1960s and 70s became fully aware of the political crimes and evils perpetrated by their parents and grandparents. And together with those older generations, the second generation had to decide what to do about the fact that many criminals and people, otherwise severely compromised, held high office in post-war Germany. The second generation also, as he understood it, defined itself by what it took to be its distinctive problem: how to respond clear-sightedly, politically and morally to the discovery that someone you love or admire greatly, a teacher perhaps, is guilty of the crimes of the Holocaust, or was, in one of many possible ways, complicit in them. In The Reader, the issue of the second generation is dramatised by the relationship that's developed soon after the war between Hannah, a woman then in her 30s, and Michael, who was very willingly seduced by her when he was 15, and who then fell passionately in love with her. The relationship is described in considerable erotic detail, and though we have occasional misgivings about Hannah, she engages our sympathy. It's easy, I think, to see why Michael should fall in love with her and be haunted by her all his life. The memory in every detail of her physicality, undermining to one degree or another all his relationships with other women. The love affair ends with Hannah's departure, unannounced and never explained to Michael. During their relationship, she often asked him to read to her, a fact of great importance to the novel, and differently perhaps to the film, but not one that concerns me this evening. Michael sees Hannah again only when, as a law student in the 60s, he attends a trial of minor war criminals. Hannah is amongst them. She was, he discovers, a guard at Auschwitz. She selected people for the gas chambers and sometimes took especially fragile young girls under her temporary care so that they would read to her, only later to send them too to the gas chambers. And when the Allies closed on Auschwitz, she became a guard on the infamous Death March. And during that time, together with her co-defendants, she refused to open a door to allow prisoners to escape from a bombed church, though they were burning alive. Her reason for refusing to open the door? To do so, she said, would have entailed disobeying orders and would have caused chaos. She's accused of having written a report that would establish her primary responsibility on the night of the fire. At first, she denies that she wrote it, but then, untruthfully, it transpires, admits to it, because she would prefer to suffer the penalty for that admission rather than to admit that she couldn't have written the report because she's illiterate. Only Michael knows this. He infers it from the court proceedings and then puts that together, what he infers from those proceedings, with things in the past that previously had baffled him. Hannah is sentenced to life in prison. Many people have objected that in humanizing Hannah, Schlink distracts our attention from and perhaps even invites us to excuse the terribleness of her crimes. It's one thing, they say, to draw attention to the fact that not all evildoers are monsters. That, after all, we learned from Hannah Arendt's discussion of Eichmann. But deliberately to draw a character who engages our sympathies before and even at the time when we discover that she's deeply involved, if only as an ordinary German, in the crimes of the Holocaust, well, that's another thing altogether. Auschwitz, after all, is no ordinary concentration camp. More than other events, the crimes committed there almost define our sense of the distinctive evil of the Holocaust. When Michael learns of Hannah's crimes, he tries to remember if there were signs in that early relationship that he should have detected that would have shown that she had it in her to commit such crimes. And we, the readers, are inclined to demand of Schlink, the writer, that he give us those signs under pain of failure as an artist. We're inclined to think that there must be something that will explain why a person was able to do what Hannah did. We feel that we must be able to say that we were mistaken about her when she engaged our sympathies, not merely because we didn't know that she committed such terrible crimes, but because we didn't know those aspects of her character and personality that enabled her to commit them. There are, to be sure, things that make us wonder. She hits Michael at a certain point hard with a belt, for example, taking what Inga Clendinnen called, quote, a practiced step back before she did it. In the film, by the way, she merely slaps him. But even that hitting with a belt, and even if it were a practiced step back, is surely not sufficient for us to say, now we understand how she could have done what she did. And anyhow, if it has a connection with her crimes, it may have been the effect of them as much as, and indeed instead of, an enabling disposition for them. This, I think, is one of the novel's most terrible lessons. It need not be as we think it must be. It's not just that we may not find anything, there may not be anything that explains Hannah's behaviour in such a way as to enable us to say rightly that we were mistaken about her, that she didn't deserve Michael's love and our sympathy after all. It's therefore not, I think, evasive or morally offensive to portray her as someone with whom Michael could rightly have fallen in love. And if that's true of Hannah, who committed terrible crimes, then it will be more evidently so of people who were guilty to varying degrees by omission rather than commission. And that, I believe, is a deeper lesson about the Holocaust than even the one that teaches that people who commit terrible crimes are not necessarily monsters. Literature and other forms of art are better placed to reveal this, I think, than are the more discursive disciplines of science, political theory or philosophy. Well, you may have noticed how naturally I spoke of the entanglement of Schlink's generation. Entanglement is his word, by the way. Entanglement of Schlink's generation in the crimes of the Holocaust. I could have said in the crimes of the Hitler years, or I could have said of crimes of the Third Reich. But to think of that period as defined by crimes of the Holocaust comes naturally to us now. And it wasn't always so, indeed. As Tony Judt pointed out, when the genocide against the Jews and the Gypsies was carried out, and for some years after, it mattered only to its victims. The dawning realization in the 1960s in Germany and elsewhere of what really happened under the Third Reich had two aspects. The first could be revealed in film footage, in documents, in facts revealed in trials, and so on. And I'll call that simply knowledge of the facts, thinking of the concept of a fact in the way a judge would when he might say to an emotional or theatrical witness, "Stick to the facts, please." And facts, in this sense, are put in textbooks, accumulated in encyclopedias, and so on. As well as learning more of the facts, however, people were trying also to understand the significance or the meaning of those facts. And it's important to remember, as I indicated at the beginning of this lecture, that we, and I mean everybody, not only the Germans, are still trying to understand. To understand the meaning of those facts, we turned, and still turn, to writers like Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel or Hannah Arendt. And if you've read The Reader, you'll realise that the names I just mentioned, Wiesel, Arendt, Levi, are authors whose books Michael found in Hannah's cell after she killed herself. The film, by the way, doesn't tell us the names of those authors. We just see that there are books there. While in prison, she taught herself to read. Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, was one of the first, and to my mind is still one of the most important works to alert us to the importance, the moral, legal and political importance of understanding why genocide is called a crime against humanity and why it's a crime different and more serious than mass murder, even when mass murder involves more victims. We still argue about how to understand genocide and crimes against humanity, and we still argue about whether there's an aspect of the Holocaust that's different from and worse than those crimes which no legal category can adequately capture. Well, it's well known to anybody who followed the literature that it was not until the 60s that people began to understand that the Holocaust is different, is a crime different, or that crimes that constitute the Holocaust are crimes different from mass murder, even when mass murder has many victims. Different in kind, indeed, from the many mass murders of that blood-soaked century. Even its victims, the Jews, thought for a long time that it differed only in its efficient brutality from earlier pogroms in Eastern Europe, where sometimes as many 3,000 people were killed in a single day. The concepts of genocide and crimes against humanity, with their inexpugnable moral dimensions, are inseparable, I think, from what we mean by the Holocaust, and therefore from our sense of its distinctive terribleness. Yet most of the people who committed those crimes did not understand what they did in terms of those concepts, whose significance we are still trying to fathom. In one sense of that morally complicated phrase, they did not know fully what they were doing. In her widely acclaimed book, Reading the Holocaust, a book that the New York Times judged to be the best book of 1999, Inga Clendinnen asked, I quote, "Is the guilt attaching to the intention to destroy a whole people different in kind from the intention to kill an equal number of individuals? Does the crime of genocide inhabit a moral category of its own?" End of quote. It's an important question, though she made no attempt to answer it. Many people have asked it when they contemplate the unnerving, even distasteful distance between the abstract nature of the concept of genocide, the many distinctions needed to delineate its structure, and the horrific details of the crimes to which the concepts applied. We feel the need to make clear what it is that makes genocide always a terrible crime, but the judicial and philosophical attempts to do so often seem so abstract, so far from anything that reveals to our sensibility the terribleness of what happened, that they can seem obscene beside the concrete, imaginatively vivid descriptions of mass murder. As in those descriptions, often in the first person, in poetic language, or at any rate, the moving language of narrative, not the discursive language of conceptual or legal analysis, that seems to us to do the moral work of making us aware of what it means to have been the victims, and indeed to have been the perpetrators of such crimes. When we've seen the corpses, the death camps, the chilling application of bureaucracy and technology, when art has revealed to our moral faculties the true meaning of these things, then don't we know all that it is morally relevant for a full appreciation of what happened during the Holocaust? Why, some people asked, was there so much intellectual fuss, so much argument and so much soul-searching about the nature of a crime against humanity, the name that was given by the Nuremberg judges to the crimes of the Holocaust in order to distinguish them from war crimes and crimes against the peace? We know these same people say what the victims suffered. Would it have made a difference to their terror, their pain, their humiliation, if they'd known their murderers and tormentors were guilty of a crime against humanity, one that's called genocide? Well, the rhetorical force of those questions is, I think, undeniable. Surprisingly, the author of Guilt About the Past doesn't explore them. Schlink, novelist and legal philosopher, would seem to be an ideal person to do so. In the reader, we know that Hannah is guilty of crimes that define the Holocaust. And we also know, as I said earlier, that she read, amongst others, Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Jean Amery, Hannah Arendt. To try to understand what she did, or what she'd been part of, it was right that Hannah should read Primo Levi. Did she need also to read someone like Hannah Arendt? Or to put the question about Arendt another way, does it matter to Hannah's understanding of what she did and of Michael's understanding of what it means to have become morally entangled with her crimes, that she was an accomplice to genocide and therefore to a crime against humanity? The reader, it seems to me, is silent on this. Perhaps Schlink thought that because the reader is a novel, though it's a reflective novel, it would be unacceptably didactic to try to answer in a novel such a question, or even to provide the materials for an answer. Perhaps, I don't know. But if we put the same question to the legal philosopher, to the author of Guilt About the Past, then we discover that he's also silent about it in that capacity. Guilt About the Past does have a final chapter on fiction and the Holocaust, but it has nothing to say on what it means for our understanding of some of the big concepts of the jurisprudence of international law, that what writers like Levi have to teach us depends on the literary quality of their writing. It depends, I'd say, on the fact that their writing and our reflection upon their writing is inescapably in what I previously called the realm of meaning. That is to say, necessarily answerable to the critical concepts that define that realm as one in which style and content can't be separated. And that's why I said earlier that it's intrinsic to what Levi and Wiesel have to teach us that we must ask whether they have yielded to a temptation to pathos and to sentimentality and so on. That being so, it's intrinsic to what they have to teach us, I think, what they have to give to our understanding, what they have cognitively to offer us, that it not be, even in principle, separable from its style in order to become suited to assessment in a tone-free zone, in which zone, that tone-free zone, it would be as wrong-headed to ask whether what they had to offer was undermined by sentimentality as it would be to ask that of a proposition in physics. Well, many of my friends who are writers find astonishing the suggestion that we need legal philosophy, with its propensity to make many and fine distinctions, to tell us what is so morally terrible about what Hannah did. If we need to know the terribleness of what it is to commit and to suffer genocide, to be vividly and soberly before our minds, they ask, should we not, and they ask this usually rhetorically, should we not turn to art rather than to philosophy? And to my literary friends, I answer with a yes and with a no. Survivors of genocide who know of the genocidal intentions of their persecutors suffer, I think, different and deeper trauma than those who have survived mass murder only. People who are the victims of genocide and the contempt that is intrinsic to our paradigms of it suffer terrible natural harm, such as pain and fear, and terrible evils, such as murder, rape, and torture. In addition, they suffer the distinctive evil of being treated as pollutants of the earth, as vermin, or in other ways, undeserving of a place in the world. Worse still, some of them suffer the knowledge that their loved ones were the victims of such contempt, and that conditions through and through the nature of their trauma. That's true of all the survivors of genocide. Survivors of the Holocaust also suffer the knowledge that the Holocaust originated in perhaps the most civilized nation in Europe, and that other great European nations were, in different ways, accomplices to it. And that's different, I believe, from the terrible pain that comes from knowing, as the Tutsis, for example, came to know some years later, that those same civilized nations and others abandoned them to their murderers. I mean, it's different to be willing participants in the murder than merely to abandon the Jews to the murder. It's different, I think, because more than all other genocides and persecutions, the Holocaust destroyed or radically undermined in its victims a sense of being at home in the community of nations, and indeed in the world. Great artistry, I think, is needed to bring up the way that this evil lacerates the soul. Artistry that I think, as I suggested, Levy has, but Wiesel lacks. And because it's inseparable from an understanding of what the victims of the Holocaust suffered, it's inseparable from an understanding of what the perpetrators did, and therefore of what others in the second generation, like Michael, became entangled with. That's the yes part of my answer to my literary friends. Great artistry is needed to reveal this kind of suffering. But now comes the no part. The power of narratives like Levy's to teach us about genocide depend, I believe, on our capacity to locate them against the background of a common understanding, whose conceptual structure is one of the distinctive tasks of philosophy, including, of course, legal philosophy, to elaborate, and if possible, to render perspicuous. It's the kind of a legal philosophy that I hoped Schlink would do in Guilt About the Past. Philosophy in the realm of meaning, written in an idiom in which form and content can't be separated. He didn't do it, but had he done it, his work would have been a fine illustration of the way literature speaks to us only against a background of a shared understanding that is partly, but necessarily constituted not only by other arts, but also by more discursive modes of thought and imagination. Even when it's reflective, as the reader is, literature can't do that conceptual work alone. But philosophy won't do it well either, unless it's seriously responsive to art. And it'll be seriously responsive to art only when it abandons the belief that we must always extract from the distinctive forms of art an intellectual content that can be delivered to a court of science and philosophy and assessed in what I previously called a tone-free zone. Assessed there before we can accept it with good intellectual conscience. Without the conception of discursive thought that's rendered distinctive by the way it's answerable to the critical concepts that define the realm of meaning, we'll be bereft, I think, of an adequate sense of the subject matter of philosophical anthropology. That is, all I mean by that is a philosophically reflective concern with what it means to live a human life, and in which case, of course, legal philosophy will be part of that. To put it simply, but I hope not too repetitively, legal philosophy can only be done in what I've called the realm of meaning, in a mode of discursive thought defined by the way in which that thought is answerable to the critical concepts that define that realm. It's a truism that if international law is to realise its ambitions to constitute the nations of the earth as a community of nations, it must express values that are in some sense universal. What kind of universality is presupposed? Well, it is, as we've seen when thinking about Kant, natural and common to think that the universal values expressed in those laws will be principles that can be abstracted from the cultures of the nations that are answerable to those principles. And those values, this thought continues, could be, and ideally should be, expressed in a language that consciously prescinds from the local, historically conditioned associations and resonances of natural languages. But as I hope I've made clear, there is at least another way of thinking about universality. And it's suggested by the idea that great literature potentially speaks to all the peoples of the earth, but only as translated from one natural language into another. Our understanding of what it means to commit and to suffer the crimes prohibited by international law, what it means, for example, to commit or to be a victim of genocide, or to commit and be a victim of torture, is often deepened by art when a film or a painting or a play or a novel or a poem moves us, for example. And art provides a different model for universality than does science or political or moral philosophy, of a kind that seeks to abstract universal principles from the concrete circumstances of peoples who are intellectually and spiritually nourished by the way they've been rooted in this or that particular culture. Every writer needs an address, said Isaac Bashevis Singer in one of my favourite quotations. That's a fine way of putting the point that I've been trying to make. This shows itself, as I suggested earlier, in the universality we attribute to great literature, which we often say speaks to experiences that all human beings share by virtue of their common humanity. Great literature often speaks to peoples of all kinds, at all times, and in all parts of the earth. But that's not because we've been unable to develop a single universal language, as people used to hope to do with Esperanto. It's because that's the kind of universality that's appropriate to the content of great literature. Content which usually can't be separated from its form, and whose form can't be separated from the contingencies that have nourished particular cultures, particular forms of living, particular natural languages. In that kind of universality, we find the right connection, I believe, between universal law and a sense of the common humanity of all the peoples of the earth.